Okay. We'll get another car seat. I'll invite you to turn over to Revelation chapter 2. We're still working our way out. Revelation chapter 2. So, I appreciate so much Travis stepping in last week and doing that for me. I thought he did an excellent job. Now, I had an outline for all 7 churches that I did not send him, and he used the outline. So, we must read the same books. And so, or it was close to the same outline. We must read the same books, but that's good. We are doing the Revelation as part of our LTC training for next year, and LTC is going to continue on, but it's going to look much differently. So the board is kind of right now in discussions on how that is going to look and what's going to happen. But I'm excited about some of the possibilities that are there. I'm sad about some of the possibilities that are not there at this point in time, but still feel like it's a worthwhile endeavor in terms of what we do for LTC, and we will, as a congregation, continue on. And so I think, I guess that's the youth minister's purview, so he can do something different, but I'll make a public statement that he's not in this point in time, and we can fight about it later. So no, it's not. But he did a great job in terms of dealing with the church at Ephesus. Now, we did have a private conversation that I'm going to make public. A private conversation. He said, I will do chapter 2. Okay, cool. And then it came back later that I'm going to do only the church in Ephesus. And I said, brother, I understand. Because there's so much in these churches that you want to cover all of them. And you want to be able to do that. Chapter 2 begins the picture of the churches in Ephesus. And so this was Travis's map last week. We're going to continue on. We did Ephesus last week and introduced to you the church that's there. Tonight we will do Smyrna. And so I thought about doing Smyrna and Pergamum, but we're going to do Smyrna and then we're going to try to start grouping them. But we're going to do Smyrna here. Before we get off the map, I want you to understand that Smyrna is right here, and that directly across from Smyrna is Athens, and that this is not very far, straight across the Aegean Sea. And that'll play a part in just a minute. But we're going to work our way through the 7 churches, and we are going to cover the 7 churches. We'll just have to speed up starting next week. But I wanted to submit for you some of the things that we will talk about, because in all of the churches there is a certain set of symbolism that we want to cover. And I think it's important to cover the symbolism in the churches because it's easier in the churches to dive into the symbolism and to get a feel for that than it is to try to start someplace like the second seal and then all of a sudden try to start explaining, well, this symbol means this, or this thought means that, or this is what the picture is. We are familiar with church stuff, and that's what I love about, I think, the way that the Revelation is laid out, is that he starts in a place that is very familiar to us, very familiar to who we are and to what we do. And because he starts with the church. We don't have a problem looking at someplace like the church in Ephesus and going, oh, they have lost their first love. They're doing good things, but their heart's not in it. That's an easy thing to discuss on one level, isn't it? Because we talk about churches struggle with that. It's hard to hear. It's hard to realize that a church can be doing something really good and doing it for the wrong reason or out of the wrong motivation, but we understand church stuff. And so in terms of the church stuff, we get a really good look at the symbols and symbolism. And so I want you to begin to think through the idea that as we go through the churches, there will be some symbolism we look at, and we're going to look at that sort of in the context of the letter as he writes. Now, I'm not trying to re-preach what Travis did last week in terms of introduction. I am going to say this, that we start out in Smyrna like we do with all of them with the number 7, not because it lists it in the text, but because Smyrna is one of the 7 churches in Asia. Why would God choose 7 churches? And Travis did a good job of talking about the fact that it's the divine number. Now, for me, I deal with the number 7. I go back and go, we can look at all kinds of places. And man, you can get far afield if you start looking on the internet. But, there's 7 days of creation, and God rested on the 7th. Great. There are 7 holy men listed in some order, some fashion. There are 7 seeds that grew somewhere. There are 7 whatever, and you can get way out. For me, I think the first place that we start when we deal with any sort of symbolism is we start with Revelation itself. If you look at the number 7 as it's used by John in the book that John is writing, then John uses it to describe 7 churches, 7 lampstands, 7 angels, 7 seals, 7 bowls. We have all of those 7 pictures, and they're all a picture of God's sovereignty. They're all a picture of the fact that it is the divine hand at work, that God is in charge and that God is in control. And I think that in terms of the 7 churches, that is a great place to start, is that these churches, while some of them are commendable and some of them are not, are all still under the sovereignty of God. But everything is. God continues to remain creator and ruler and king. And so Revelation is going to cement the fact that God is sovereign. When God opens 7 seals or pours out 7 bowls, then what we're doing is we're saying that God is in control of those times. No matter what we find within those pictures, we start with understanding that God is in charge. And that picture becomes absolutely important, that God does not at any point in time abdicate His authority or relieve Himself of His responsibility or take Himself out of the picture. That God is involved in all of those places and is involved from the very beginning of those things. Now, Travis gave you an outline. I told you it was a good outline. So it's one that we're gonna keep. And it's one I want you to learn, or at least to be familiar with as we walk through it, because this is the outline as we walk through all 7 churches. Did Ephesus last week. We're going to walk through the next 6 churches with this same outline. And I think that's off in a class somewhere. So I think that's Miss Robin. Are you hearing that? So I think that's Miss Robin. So I'm going to make fun of her later. So all of the letters start with a greeting. They give a title. I like to usually from chapter 1, and I like to follow that through. There's a statement of praise. There's a statement of criticism. There's a warning. There's an exhortation, and then there's a promise. Not all churches have all pieces. Okay. There are 2 churches which don't, including tonight's, which don't come with a criticism. There are 2 churches that don't come with a praise. And so those are hard places to read and hard things to deal with, but it's still true. But this is basically going to be our outline. As we look at Revelation chapter 2, starting in verse 8, we'll read the letter first in its entirety, then go back and pick through it. It says, "And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the words of the first and the last, who died and came to life. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich. And the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested. And for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death." And so it is a letter in which Jesus opens it up and has something to say. And so we start with the greeting. To the angel of the church in Smyrna, write. And that's what the greeting is about. The greeting tells us where it is that Jesus wants this letter to go, who it is that He's talking to, which churches that He's talking about. And it plays a big role in terms of what's going on, because we know where to start looking. If we take a look through history or take a look back at archaeology and begin to talk about Smyrna, we talk first about the city itself. Smyrna is a place that is a rival to Ephesus. Okay, Ephesus was considered a jewel among the cities in Asia Minor in the first century, and Smyrna wanted that title, and so they worked hard at it. They worked hard at being a place that was beautiful, a place that had grand architecture, a place that had large buildings, a place that had sweeping vistas. Smyrna is built on a hillside. It runs up from the coast and into a hill, and they wanted this to be a grand place. They wanted this to be someplace that folks wanted. They wanted to steal trade from the other cities around. They wanted to be the place. It's funny. My parents lived in Blooming Grove, and there's a lot of stuff in Blooming Grove that used to be grand, but then they moved the county seat, the railroad stop, to Corsicana, and Blooming Grove just never was quite what it was supposed to be. And that's kind of Smyrna. Smyrna wants to be something bigger and something grander, and they try for it, and so they try to rival Ephesus. Ephesus is still the place, but Smyrna's got a lot going for it. It is a major seaport, and so it is located directly across from Athens, which we showed you on the map, which means they had a lot of trade going into Greece, and then beyond that into European countries. And they were a place that was where all of that stuff funneled through back into the Middle East and into Asia Minor. Trade came through Smyrna, and it was a major seaport, a major coastal town. Now, Smyrna, as a large city in trying to rival the world, was very loyal to Rome. And their loyalty extends back far beyond even Rome as an empire. In fact, in Smyrna, in 600 BC, there was a conqueror that came through and totally decimated the city of Smyrna. It was at that point in time, again, a growing city, a large city, but the conqueror came through and laid waste and left it as kind of a small town or a small village. And they stayed that way until Alexander the Great came through. But when Alexander came through, Alexander decided to rebuild Smyrna, and he did, and gave it these big buildings and these large temples and this big grand kind of a look. And Smyrna would remember that. And so when Alexander the Great's kingdom became a piece of Rome, they were already all in to those conquering powers, and they were already loyal. We're going to do what it is that those in charge do, and we're going to follow the trends, and we're going to follow the clothing styles, and we're going to follow the religion, and we're going to follow in those places. And so by the time Rome comes to power, Smyrna's already in their back pocket and wants to be what Rome is. They would rival Ephesus, but they really wanted to be a place that shone in the way that Rome shone. And so they were loyal in that place. But that has consequences if you're a Christian and if you're a church in the first century. The city itself, built on a hill, the top of the hill is called the Crown of Smyrna. And it's this idea that you look up and this is who they are. This shows our greatness. This shows our grandeur. This shows our ability to be in charge, our ability to be a power in the world, our ability to stand out from everyone else. It's in this culture that Jesus writes this letter to the church that is there. Before we leave behind too much of the city, there are a couple of interesting things to note. One is that Smyrna is named after a spice, and the spice is myrrh. If you'll remember that the wise men, the Magi who came to see Jesus, bought gold, frankincense, and myrrh. At the time that Jesus was buried, they wrapped him in spices, which would have included myrrh. That myrrh was a major export from Smyrna to Egypt, where the pharaohs were embalmed in it. And so their name comes from their chief product. And in fact, at times through history, Smyrna owned sort of the rights to all myrrh trading, and it all came through Smyrna to be refined and to be purified and to be made into the best that it could be, so that you could sort of guarantee the smell and guarantee the potency of it. Because if you're going to wrap dead folks in it, it needs to be potent, because they're masking some of those scents that go on beyond that. And so there is a huge trade aspect to Smyrna. As Jesus writes to the church there, we understand that the church itself was probably founded by Paul during his third missionary journey. If you want to turn over to Acts chapter 19, it is a general statement here that we sort of read about. But in Acts 19, verse 10, it says, this continued for 2 years so that all the residents of Asia heard the word of the Lord, both Jews and Greeks. Now, we deal with this, Paul in Ephesus, in the hall of Tyrannus. And folks, going back, we could look at this for all of the 7 churches in terms of, we believe that from our study, you'll remember in Colossae, that while Paul had never visited Colossae, he is familiar with people there, probably because it's at this time, in these 2 years, that somebody from Colossae stayed and studied, went back and founded the church in Colossae. Same for Hierapolis, the same for Laodicea. We think it's probably the same for Smyrna, but there is some understanding that this may be a place that Paul did actually visit. But it's a possibility. It comes from Pauline roots, if nothing else. We would talk about the fact that it was founded somewhere between 53 and 56 A.D. So shortly after the death of Jesus, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, on into Paul's ministry, shortly before the diaspora of the Jews from Jerusalem. And so it is a place that has a church, and it is a place where the church was. But probably most notably for us in history and in church history is the presence, or the very likely presence, of a man named Polycarp. Polycarp was a student of John the Apostle, the same apostle who is writing the Revelation. And Polycarp's actual title, how we actually know him, is we know him in church history as Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna. And that this is where he would have led the church. And the likelihood of him being here at this particular time is good. That he would have been with John, if the timing is right, before John would have gone to Patmos, because John would have come from Patmos back to Ephesus for a couple of years before his death. And so Polycarp probably learned early in Ephesus from John. We know that Polycarp died in 155, and so that would put him in Smyrna for 60 years. That he died at the age of 85. And so he would have been 20 years older around that when he went and began to worship at the church in Smyrna and began to be invested with them there. We don't know if he was there when the letter got there or not, but we do know that he's there in 155. And we know that he's been there for quite some time because he has a reputation in town. And we're going to come back to Polycarp in a little while. But the presence of notable people in Smyrna, I think, is important because of what Smyrna is. So we start with the greeting. We go on to the title of Christ in this place. And the title that Jesus announces himself with in this place is the words of him. Is the words of the first and the last who died and came to life. Now, the titles or descriptions that Jesus uses of himself to the 7 churches are not simply sort of nice phrases that Jesus pulls out of thin air. They generally have something very specifically to do with the church or the culture of the city to whom Jesus is dictating the letter. For instance, in Smyrna, we talked about the fact that they were a city that believed that at one time, at 600 A.D., they had died and the city was no more. But that, with coming of Alexander the Great, the city was made alive again. And in fact, there are a large number of inscriptions that we have found that talk about Smyrna, the city that was dead and came back to life. They dealt primarily in a spice that helped folks go from life to death into the afterlife. That this language of Smyrna being a city of what was once dead and came back to life is part of their culture. It is part of their secular culture. It's part of their understanding of themselves. While Smyrna can never be destroyed, we will always return. We were a city that was once dead, and we've come back to life. And that would be the way that they would describe themselves, and the way that they wrote about themselves, and the way that they sort of encased their reputation in marble and in granite that we've uncovered in archaeological excavations, as they talk about themselves in this way. And what Jesus does in connecting himself to that is he says, you think that the world has power, but I'm going to tell you there is one who was dead and who's come back to life, and it is not the city of Smyrna, that it is Jesus Christ. And so what Jesus does is Jesus preempts the power of the world and preempts their history and preempts their understanding of how the world works. That life from death does not come from hard work. It does not come from personal power. It doesn't come from what it is that I can think. It comes from Jesus Christ, who is the firstborn of the dead. Chapter 1, verse 5 is that list that this title would come from. That Jesus would announce himself as the firstborn of the dead. Smyrna thinks that's hot stuff, but Jesus says, I did it first. Right? And that's the way that it works. That in reality, resurrection power belongs to Jesus and to Jesus alone. The praise for Smyrna is found in this place in verse 9. I know your tribulation and your poverty, that you are rich, and the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. The word for tribulation here that's used is a specific word, and it's a word that means I know the weight that presses down on you. The idea here is that in the first century there was a form of torture in Asia Minor in which they would lay you out on a table and they would begin to pile weight on your chest. And they would continue to pile it on slowly and steadily until you couldn't breathe, until really it crushed you and you suffocated from the weight, or it broke your bones. And it's this idea of pressing down that Jesus uses these words. I know the weight that presses on you. I know the burden that you carry. I know what it is to be under trial. And think about, for just a minute, the church that sits there and says, this is the one who is dead, who's come back to life, who's talking about the fact that he knows what it means to be judged, and what it means to be accused, and what it means to be pressed upon, right? I know your poverty. And he talks about physical poorness. To be a Christian in the first century, a lot of times was to not be able to participate in things like local religious rites. And so, in a place like Smyrna, who was in love with Rome, a Christian would not say Caesar is Lord. And if they wouldn't say Caesar is Lord, they couldn't belong to the trade union, so they couldn't work. They'd have a business that wasn't supported by the Chamber of Commerce. They would be thrown out of jobs that they had because they wouldn't follow suit. They would not pursue Rome in the same way that the pagans would pursue it, and so they didn't have a place in society. They became a subculture. They became outcasts. They became this sort of sect of the Jews, possibly. They belong over there with those Jewish people who will not say Caesar is Lord either. Now, the Jewish religion is exempt because they're just too much trouble, and Rome has just said, fine, don't say it. As long as you keep your God in your place, then you just do what you want. But they became this sort of subculture. But they were a subculture that wasn't wanted. They were a subculture that even the Jews would slander. Those Christians aren't a part of us. Do you know what they do? They get together on a Sunday and they partake of a love feast. They are sexual deviants. There's orgies that go on in there, and they drink blood and they eat a body of this Christ. We don't know how they kept it so long, but they participate in cannibalism. They're not Jewish. They don't have anything Jewish about them. It's this kind of slander that would spread in the first century about the church because of what they did and how they did it. They would not bow to Caesar. They would not act Jewish, so they didn't belong anywhere. They were a culture that stood apart, a culture that stood differently. And because of that, there would be weight after weight that was put down on them, that was pressed on them. The picture that Jesus draws in this place is the synagogue of Satan. Even those that are supposed to know God will not accept Jesus as Messiah. They will persecute the church. They will slander the church. See, the Jews are supposed to be a synagogue of God. They're supposed to be God's people at work in the world, and yet they have not recognized Jesus as Messiah. They stand in a place where they accuse. Right? It's funny the way that we look at that. It says, that place again in verse 9, the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan, do not fear what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested for 10 days. And this idea of synagogue of Satan and the devil at work is the idea here that Jesus says you are the chief accusers of the church. But that's not a bad place to be if you're in the church, because the Jews were the chief accusers of Jesus at the cross, weren't they? And he says it continues to happen in this place. The symbolism there is one that people try to connect something weird to, and I don't think there's anything weird there. I think it's simply this opposition to what it is that God is doing, that the Jews continue to participate as they have participated before in this place. But the praise is, you are rich in the midst of tribulation and poverty. That with all of the weight that you carry, and all of the slander that you endure, and all of the accusation that you take, you could look at yourself and say, oh, poor us. Oh, how bad we have it. Oh, things are terrible. You will not believe the trials that I experience. You will not believe the pressures that I have. You will not believe. But that doesn't seem to be what the church in Smyrna is doing. The church in Smyrna has looked at their lot and said, we will trust Jesus. And we will follow Jesus into poverty and into trial. That we will remain faithful. And that we will remain true. If you turn over to Luke chapter 12 for just a minute, there's a story I think that sort of encapsulates what it is that our understanding there is of the meaning here to be rich. In Luke chapter 12, we have Jesus, and he's in the city, and he's walking around, and he's talking to folks, and as he's going through this crowd, chapter 12, verse 13, it says, someone in the crowd said to him, Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. Now, I want you to imagine that for a minute. Here comes Jesus, and he's followed by crowds, and the crowds are around him, and Jesus is walking through, and you've got one shot to say something to Jesus, right? And you say, tell my brother to pay me. And you think, okay, Jesus is going to ignore that, all right? We'll go on. But Jesus doesn't. Jesus hears this guy who says, my brother has wronged me, and I've got the short end of the stick. Verse 15, he said to them, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. Smyrna, who wants to be bigger and have more and have power and have riches to rival Ephesus or to compete with Rome. Riches does not consist of abundance of possessions. He told them a parable saying, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. I will put to death what I had before and bring something new to life. That's the way Smyrna would have thought of that, right? In those kind of terms. And that's supposed to be a good thing. He said, I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. Develop a culture of pride in self. Develop a culture of ease. Develop a culture of entertainment. Develop a culture that is humanistic and says it's all about what we can get for ourselves and what we can do for ourselves and how we can relax, eat, drink, be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God. And so Jesus says it's bad to have stuff, but that's not what he says. Jesus says, if you've got everything in the world, but you have not laid up treasure in heaven, if you are not rich toward God, then you have nothing. It's not a matter of what you have here on earth. A lot, a little, somewhere in the middle. What matters is that your priority is to have riches towards God. Is to be someone who's faithful. Is to be someone who's not controlled by covetousness. Is to be someone who's not controlled by their own ideals of ease and comfort. To be someone who's not shaped by the world, but is shaped by God. So in the midst of great poverty, Jesus writes, you are rich. No matter what they say, no matter what they do, Smyrna, you are rich as a church there because you have been faithful. The praise comes before the criticism in these churches. And for Smyrna, there is no criticism. For Smyrna, there is not a word from Jesus about what it is that they've done wrong. Ephesus had lost their first love. Laodicea will be lukewarm. But for Smyrna, we skip that part. And I love that because the picture in Smyrna is a picture of it's hard. And how easy would it be to give up and move on and to do something different? But the Christians there don't. The Christians there have among their number men and women who, in the face of great trial, in the face of great persecution, do not waver, do not fall. They hang on to Jesus in those times. They remain true to who it is that has called them and the life that it is that they are supposed to live. They do get a warning about what it is that is to come. Do not fear, verse 10, what you are about to suffer. And that's got to be hard to hear. Haven't we suffered enough? I mean, you've already acknowledged the fact that we live under this great weight. You've already acknowledged the fact that we are in severe poverty. What is there that's coming? Jesus says, do not fear what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested. And for 10 days you will have tribulation. You will have a greater weight placed upon you. You'll have a greater weight in what it is that happens. Jesus says there is more to come, and that is not a surprise. To be a Christian in Smyrna is to understand that when Rome sets about to persecute the church, Smyrna goes all in. When the emperor announces, we don't like Christians, Smyrna says, all right, we're going to follow through. We're going to throw them to the wild animals. We'll burn them at the stake. We will kill them with the sword. And there is ample evidence that Smyrna was prepared to do all of that to the church in their city, because it's what Rome required. Christians would go to prison. Christians would go to death. And Jesus says, but do not fear. Hold on to what it is that you know is true. Hold on to what it is, because it's going to happen for 10 years. So we get to the number 10 in this place. Does that mean that we will deal with the physical 10 years? There are some who think that that's true, that we can look at a couple of the persecutions and say, well, they lasted about a decade while the emperor was in charge. The problem with that is it's not all of those happened in that way. That emperors persecuted at different times for different reasons and for different lengths of time. What I think when we begin to look at the number 10 in the book of Revelation is we think through the number 10 again and how it's used. John in the book of Revelation doesn't use it a lot. But in the places that we do see it, we think of 10 commandments. I think of 10 plagues. Same way that the number 7 leads to God's sovereignty, I think the number 10 leads to God's work. That in the plagues He would set forth His mighty hand, is what He tells Moses. That in the 10 commandments, they are written with the finger of God, and they define who the people are. But in Revelation, it mentions the fact that God will be at work in a special way in His people. I think in this place comforting and upholding them and watching over them, but that it's for a defined time. That it is a long time, it's not a short time, but it comes to an end. We believe in that concept. That yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Your rod and your staff comfort me. And then on the other side of the shadowy valley, we come to a place where God has set a table before us. That when we face hard times in life, we hang on because we know that their end is coming. We know that God leads us through those places. And this is I think the comfort in the warning, is that for 10 years, for a defined period of time, for a period of time that you can handle, for a period of time that you can, I said 10 years, 10 days, that you can handle. Who can't handle anything for 10 days? There was a time in my life I thought, man, they did that for a year. There's not much I can't do for a year anymore. It's just not that long. 10 days, easy. That Jesus is defining a short time, a time that is well defined, a time that can seem hard in those 10 days. We think about people who are in the midst of trial now, or in the midst of tribulation, or have a heavy weight on them, and they carry that for 10 days, and our hearts just melt for them. But we understand that God walks in that place with them. And so the exhortation there is, the warning there is, do not fear. Do not be afraid. The exhortation comes in the idea where he says, be faithful unto death, right? Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. Hang on. Don't let go. Don't become unfaithful in this place. There is a crown of life that is laid up for you, right? Paul talks about it. I think one of my favorite places to deal with the idea of crown of life is in James chapter 1. And James will let's see if I marked it here. I pulled out my bookmark. So in James chapter 1, verse 12, James will write about this crown of life. He will say, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life which God has promised to those who love him. And so the exhortation there is to be faithful, that God has a crown, God has a victory, God promises a victory to those who love him and persevere through trial. That hope is never lost, that we never reach the end, so long as we will hang on to what it is that God has promised. The promise is, as Travis pointed out last week, always framed in this idea of ears to hear. And I wanted to stop and talk about that idea of ears to hear for just a minute. He who has an ear, verse 11, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. And that phrase will be repeated over and over again. But this idea of he who has ears to hear, let him hear, is not first found in Revelation. We find it in the teaching of Jesus. If you go to Matthew 11 or to Mark 4, the parable of the sower, and I'm not going over there if you are. In the parable of the sower, you'll remember that Jesus, as he ends in that parable, says, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. And what has he told them? He's told them about good soil that produces a crop. He says, I want you to hear what it is that God can do. I want you to hear what it is that you can be. You can be ground that is covered in rocks, or ground that is covered in thorns, or ground that is weighed down by a path, or you can give yourself to God, surrender yourself to God, and be good soil. See, the one who surrenders to God's transforming power is the one who has ears to hear, is the one who listens to what the Spirit has to say, is the one who is paying close attention to what it is that God desires. And so that phrase is, in of itself, always a promise to those that will pay attention. It is a promise to those that will surrender to what it is that God has called them to be. It is a promise to those who will repent in those churches that are criticized. It is a promise to those that hold faithful in those churches that are praised for their faithfulness. And in this particular instance, he says, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. And we come back to death in that place. And Jesus reminds them of this idea of the second death. Every man will face the first death, and that is the physical death that we suffer. But not everyone faces the second death, the spiritual death. Those who remain with Jesus, those who hold faithful in persecution, those who are rich towards God, are people who understand that the second death has no effect on us, that the second death does not overcome us, that the second death does not hold us in its power. If the letter went out, if the revelation went out in 94 or in 95 or in 96, then in Smyrna, it's very possible that a young man named Polycarp in his 20s would have heard the letter. And he would have said, this is the goal for this church. This is what Jesus requires of us. This is what God calls us to be. And that for 60 years, that young man would grow into an old man. I mean, folks didn't always live to be 85 in the Bible. But that he would, over the course of the next 60 years, give himself to the idea of surrender, and give himself to the idea of faithfulness, and give himself to an understanding of the fact that he belonged to God. So that at age 85, there would be a group of Roman people that would show up at his door and say, "Are you Polycarp, bishop of the church here?" And he would say, "I am." And they would say, "You have to come with us. What you need to do is you need to burn a little piece of incense, and you need to say Caesar is Lord." Polycarp would say, "I'm not going to do that. That's not who I am. It's not how I've lived. It's not going to happen." "Well, if it doesn't happen, we're going to throw you to wild dogs." And Polycarp says, "No, you won't throw me to wild dogs. You'll burn me, but you won't throw me to wild dogs." And they said, "Well, that's right. We'll burn you. If you don't burn the incense, we'll burn you." And Polycarp would say, "For 85 years has God been faithful to me. Why would I reject him now?" And Polycarp will refuse to burn the incense, and he will refuse to say Caesar is Lord, because Polycarp believes that Jesus is Lord. Because Polycarp believes that faithfulness unto death is what carries us past the second death. Polycarp would say, "You can kill me here, but my hands are in the hands of God." And the letter that we have that describes his martyrdom talks about the fact that they handled him roughly, and that he skinned his legs. And 85-year-old people have thin skin sometimes and bleed easy. And you got to imagine, here's a guy who's in pain. Here's a guy who hurts. They take him to where a fire has been laid. They lay the sticks around him, and they pull out a series of nails and a hammer, because the custom at that point in time is to nail you to a stake. And Polycarp says, "You don't have to nail me. I'm not going anywhere. If I have to die here for the Lord, that's what I'll do." And so instead of nailing him to the stake, they tie him. Now, by the time we get to the 3rd century, there's all kinds of stuff that comes up about Polycarp, about how the fire couldn't burn him, and they pierced him with a dagger, and the blood flowed out and put out the fire, and still Polycarp lived, and all of this. But the reality is Polycarp died, burned at the stake that day. But he died in such a way that he was faithful till the end. See, the letters that are written here are not written to invisible people. They're not written to be sort of nice feeling and to make us go, "Oh, well, that's yeah, kind of." They are meant to change the way that we live when we face serious stuff. They are meant to change the way that we live when the world doesn't want us, and when we stand in places of persecution. They are meant to encourage us when the load seems too heavy to bear, or the cost seems too big to pay. Men like Polycarp would have heard the letter and said, "That's who I'm going to be. I'm going to be faithful unto death." And then, through the power of God, he was. It is that same power at work in the church today. That the letter to Smyrna is the letter to Spring Creek that says, no matter what it is that's going on in the world, you be faithful to death. You be my people. You stand up in this place and you proclaim, "We gladly follow God, because God has always led us where we need to be." I think that's the letter to the church in Smyrna. And I think that's what it is that we take away from that. The words of the first and the last who died and came to life. Jesus announces in that very opening that he is a God who brings life from death, who brings newness from what is old, who heals what is broken. The invitation to Smyrna to be his is the invitation that God offers to everyone today. That in our brokenness and in our sin, there is restoration and there is healing in Jesus. Will we give our lives to him? Will we in this place, be faithful unto death. To start that journey, we talk about baptism and death, burial, and resurrection. To follow Him who was dead and is now alive. At times we struggle, but the invitation to repent is to turn away from things that are dead and turn back to life. And so that invitation stands for us. If at home you are watching and you need to respond, we invite you to call or to email. If you're here tonight and you need to respond to the gospel, then we invite you to come forward.